So it's clear there's a requirement to modernise legislation. What are the key changes and requirements to the existing legislation then?
Yeah, well, to be fair, there's many similarities with the current legislation, to be honest. But there are new requirements and some enhancements as well. I think businesses are going to have to think about putting projects together. They're going to have to look at their resources. They're going to have an awareness, and it could be communication with the staff. Money might be made available. They're going to have to take some serious measures thinking about how they implement these new changes. But let's consider what the changes are, first of all. Well, first of all, I guess data subject rights. I mean, the current legislation is they've got rights of access, they've got all sorts of rights that it's got to be used lawfully. It shouldn't be held for longer than necessary, but there are some really important new rights for individuals under their data. And the two most significant, I think, are they will have the right to be forgotten. So, for example, and I think this is important for social media as well in particular, so if they feel that their data is being held by an organisation, but actually there's no longer any need for that data to be held, well, they do have the right to have that deleted. And in other words, that's the term, the right to be forgotten. So that's a really important enhancement. I believe. At the same time as well, and again it's linked to technology, I think, because of social media and different platforms that people move from one application to another, and it's called the right of portability. So what that means is that an individual should be able to request that his data is moved from one provider to another provider, and that should be handled swiftly and cleanly. And businesses must recognise that they may have to have the data in a format that is easily transferable to another provider. So again, that's quite a significant change.
So that's the right of portability, the second point, and then the first point you made before that was the right to be forgotten.
Yeah.
What about things like data subject rights and subject access rights?
Yeah.
Like that?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Subject access rights are changing as well. Now, the current legislation, individuals do have the right to request the data that an organisation holds about them. So they've got that right at the moment. The key change is this. At the moment, companies can charge a small fee for providing that data. And also, they've got, I think it's 40 days at the moment to provide that data. Now, the key change is this. The data must be provided free of charge, and the data must be provided within a month rather than 40 days. So the timescales are tighter, and you no longer can charge for it. One or two exceptions to that. I think if you get malicious requests or people requesting data more than once, a number of occasions, you are then allowed to make a small charge. But even then, it's not a punitive charge. It must be the genuine cost of the administration.
Right. And consent.
Well, consent. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Consents are going to be much stricter. Mm-hmm. In the way, consent is not quite often provided by a privacy notice. Consent is going to have to be dealt with by a more positive and affirmative action by the individual. So it's no longer going to be possible just to assume consent. An individual must actually tick positively on a website, for example, that they consent for the data to be used. And it can't be general either. It has to be specific over particular purposes. So that will strengthen. And in the particular case of children, there will be increased protection for children, recognising the use of social media and so on. And the consent process, in many cases, will rely on parental consent. So consent is an area of significant change.
Gosh, that's new. And there's also the data protection officer. Is that a changing role?
Yeah, I mean, there is a change in the data protection officer. The key one being that in some instances now, moving forward, a business will have to formally appoint a data protection officer. I mean, many have data protection officers now, especially a big business, but there's no compulsion to do so. Now, In certain circumstances, you will need a formally appointed data protection officer, and that is where you are actually processing data on a large scale, a large number of individuals on a large scale that's high risk to that individual, or a large scale processing of sensitive data. So that's data related to health records, criminal records, religious beliefs, political beliefs, etc. Or, for example, if you're monitoring a large number of people on CCTV, again, you would then have to appoint a data protection officer. So that's another thing businesses are going to have to consider. I think in any event, regardless of the formal appointment of a data protection officer, all these measures that are being introduced do require at least someone in the business to take formal responsibility. So it might not be officially a data protection officer, but somebody will have to be allocated responsibility for managing all these changes.
Right. And can you tell us about privacy notices then?
Privacy notices, again, it's linked with the consent, really, the privacy notices. Funnily enough, privacy notices is one of these odd things. They're going to be much stricter, privacy notices. People are going to have to be told more information about how the data is used, who the data protection officer is, whether it's transferred outside the EU, who it's transferred to. But at the same time, whilst more information has to be provided, the GDPR states that it must be intelligible, clear and concise. So therein there is a dilemma, because it's been pointed, I think someone pointed out that if an individual read all the privacy notices that they see every time they're browsing the internet or going on websites, it takes them like 76 continuous days to read them all. I think the average number of pages on a privacy number of words on a privacy notice, it's thousands, it's a couple of thousand. So there lies in a dilemma. We've got more information, but it's got to be clearer and more concise. That is going to be a difficult area for businesses.
Yeah. And there's people been talking about a sort of privacy impact assessment. What is that?
Yeah, one of the concepts of the general data protection regulations are trying to introduce is this concept of data protection by design and default. What they mean by that is, he's not looking at things after the event, but building in good design that will manage data protection from the outset. So that might be, just thinking about, do we need to hold all this data? So data minimization. When can we get rid of things earlier? And I think the key to this, one of the key aspects of data protection by design and default, is if you're implementing a new system, new piece of technology or a new project, which involves the collection of personal data, what the GDPR is saying is, in those instances, you really should conduct a privacy impact assessment so that you're analysing how the data is going to be protected from the offset. So you're building in the correct privacy notices, you're building in the correct security and data protection.
I was going to say, and I suppose that if you don't do it and you get it wrong, there's some hefty sanctions or fines.
Yeah, well, of course, one of the reasons that, if you like, when we say the clock's ticking and it's coming in effective from May next year, I think another factor, other than the timescale, that has got people talking and worried is the new sanctions regime, because the fines now available to the Information Commissioner's Office or other supervisory authorities across Europe is a fine of up to 20 million euros.
Wow. Or
4% of your worldwide turnover, whichever is the greater. So it's food for thought about the action that you take.
Well, it shows why it's worth getting to grips with.
Absolutely. This is why people are taking action now. And